では本日お二人目のご講演者様に移らせていただきます。お二人目のご講演者様は斎藤幸平様です。まず斎藤幸平様のご略歴の紹介をさせていただきます。
The next guest speaker is Mr. Kohei Saito. He is an associate professor at Graduate School of Economics, Osaka City University. He specialized in economic and social thought. He completed the doctoral program in philosophy from the Humboldt University of Berlin. He's also received the prestigious Deutscher Memorial Prize for his book, Karl Marx, Eco-Socialism, Capital, Nature, and the Unfinished Critique of Political Economy. In 2020, he was awarded the Japan Society for Promotion Science Prize. He is the author of Mirai no Daibunki, a collection of conversations with Marcus Gabriel and others. His best-selling book, Hitoshinsei no Shihondon, won the New Book Award in 2021. Today, Mr. Saito will give a lecture entitled Society in Post-Corona.
斎藤様のご専門は経済思想、社会思想です。ベルリン・フンボルト大学哲学科博士課程を修了されました。大洪水の前にマルクスと惑星の物質代謝にて権威あるドイツチャー記念賞を日本人初、歴代最年少で受賞されました。2020年には日本学術振興会賞を受賞されました。また、マルクス・ガブリエル・シラとの対談集、未来への大分岐など数々の著書をお持ちです。近年ではベストセラー、人申請の資本論で新書大賞2021を受賞されました。本日、斉藤様には、アフターコロナにおける社会のあり方と題してご講演いただきます。それでは斉藤様、マイクをオンにしていただき、ご講演のほどよろしくお願いいたします。Min, can you stop share screen? Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kohei Saito. I'm the Associate Professor of Political Economy at Osaka City University. Thank you so much for inviting me for this conference. And today in my guest lecture, I would basically, repeat what Mr. Takas said, because I really share the importance of creating fair society with human dignity for everyone, etc., etc. But I have a background of Marxian economics, so I'd like to add one thing. If we really want to change, or if we really want to create a fair society, maybe it's high time to rethink about our economic system, which is capitalism. So basically, I'd like to challenge some fundamental basic assumption about our economic system. I have only 20 minutes, so I'm not sure if I can convince you guys, but we can still share. There might be some need to think about this economic system called capitalism. I share my presentation so that you can also follow my discussion better. I slightly modified my title to Envisioning a Fair Society After the Pandemic, but the basic content is the same as originally planned. So I think now we are facing a moment of the Great Reset, if I borrow the expression from the Davos Forum. Basically, this pandemic revealed two major contradiction of our current neoliberal society. So that's why Davos Forum is also arguing for changing fundamentally about our economic system. And there are two problems, basically. One is economic inequality. Even under the pandemic, some people like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos became even richer. They accumulated more wealth, while many people who can be categorized as an essential worker, they have to risk lives, they have to work, but then they still suffer from the low wages and long work hours, etc. So their working condition is getting worse and worse, while some people are becoming even richer in the middle of the crisis. And the second obvious crisis is ecological crisis. For example, the deforestation, as some scientists warned, increased the risk of this kind of the pandemic, but we kept cutting trees and destroying the environment, and that's the one reason for this COVID-19. But COVID-19 is not the last crisis. That's the point. It's not like we vaccinated and we are done with this one. It's rather just the beginning of the chronic emergency, because we have more and more of crisis, and the pandemic is one of them, but the bigger problem is climate crisis or climate breakdown. Because left as it is, the climate breakdown leads to even more severe inequality, food, water insecurity, climate refugees, and even war. So we really need to change something about this climate change, climate breakdown. We have to do something. But the problem is we really need a radical change, because the scientist says that we basically have to keep the global temperature increase within 1.5 degrees Celsius. But this goal requires 50% reduction of CO2 emission by 2030. So in the next 10 years, we have to reduce the carbon emission by half, and then reduce to zero basically by 2050. So we only have 30 years before the decreasing carbon emission. The problem is that we are really far from achieving this goal. The problem is also the insufficiency of the Paris Agreement. So the recent IPCC report published 2 weeks ago basically said we will most likely pass this 1.5 degrees Celsius in 10 years. So 2030, we will reach this limit. There is still hope, but the time is very limited. So we really have to act now. But the problem is when the existing system, the UN or any other kind of international corporation seems not really working, maybe we really need to think about the possibility that we need some kind of solution from the outside the current system. So that's why people like Greta Thunberg and her supporters from the Fridays for Futures are calling for system change, not climate change. So the system change becomes one of the polemics for our concern. In my book, Das Kapital in Anthropocene, the capital in the Anthropocene, which is currently very popular thanks to the readers, which sold more than 300,000 copies. I began, of course, in a provocative manner. Sorry, Mr. Takasu, the SDGs is the new opium of masses. Karl Marx once said religion is the new opium of masses. And I said SDGs is the new opium of masses today. Not because SDGs are really bad. I certainly respect the ideals and the ideas, and I want to highlight as much as I can the importance of the SDGs. But the problem is how it is implemented today, especially in Japan. SDGs is popular, like super popular in Japan, and you hear this word every day in the advertisement and then newspapers and then everywhere. But the problem is people just using eco bags or water bottles instead of buying plastic bags in the convenience store. That's not changing the system as Greta Thunberg demanded, right? It's just satisfying one's own sense of guilt. They just feel, oh, I did something good for the environment, and they get relievement. But the problem is that obviously the individual choices alone are unable to change this system, but the people are simply satisfied with this very superficial eco-friendly behaviors. On the other side, companies also use SDGs as a new means for selling more product and then making profit. So they use SDGs in order to continue business as usual. That's not making sense, but we need to change the system. But the problem is that current ways of SDGs are just kind of bullshit, basically. So another one, the green capitalism. People are talking about investing more on electric vehicles, EVs, and renewable energies and other things, like many things, like green technologies, etc. But I'm also skeptical about its power. I mean, we need it. We need new technologies. But if those technologies can solve all the problems about climate breakdown, I think the story sounds too good. the reality is much more severe, I guess. One of the problem is that the decoupling of GDP increase, the economic growth and carbon emission. So we need to keep economy growing, but at the same time, we need to reduce the carbon emission. So we need to decouple them. But this is not taking place on a global scale, despite those new technologies, such as electric vehicles and renewable energies. Because one of the problems is that the economic growth requires even greater energy and resources. So if we want to keep growing economy, we have to have a greater decoupling, greater efficiency and greater recycling, etc. But that's not a very good option, I think, because we have only 10 years. When we only have 10 years, we should scale down the economy. That's the basic point of the degrowth. I'm advocating for degrowth basically because economic growth is incompatible with our aim of zero carbon emission by 2050. Another problem is that Green New Deal or green recovery, so investing more on those new technologies may strengthen the ecological imperialism. So basically the high income countries will get more lithium, nickel, cobalt, and all the other rare metals. And then they have monopolized over these resources. And that will necessarily create a rising price of those rare earths. So poor countries cannot buy these resources, no matter how much they need, right? So they might end up just being dependent on the fossil fuels, and so that we cannot really achieve the net zero emission by 2050. That's a very severe consequence in the future. So the problem is that for the sake of the greening of capitalism in high-income countries in the global north, there might be more robbery and more environmental destruction in low-income countries. Is it a really greening? But for what sake, right? So we really need to envision a fairer world, no one left behind, as Mr. Taka said. But that's not the one that is actually happening under the name of Green New Deal or green recovery. So we need a different path. That's the data, that's the decoupling is not happening. The green one is the GDP increase. And then we see clearly that the material footprint, the resource use, and then the global greenhouse gas emissions are basically increasing together, right? We cannot really decouple them. And another problem is that high-income countries are basically responsible for this current climate breakdown, but the ones who suffer most are the ones who are least responsible for the crisis. I quote one sentence: Africa is responsible for only 1% of the total historic emissions, yet they will be the ones to suffer the most. That's unfair, right? But then high-income countries are taking more resources from Africa, from Latin America, to green themselves, to greenize, to ecologize themselves, but with the environmental destruction in the global south. That's unfair. That's not SDGs. So what we are suffering most is basically the poverty of imagination. We can only imagine the solutions that are basically not changing our way of life, thanks to technologies. We can have electric vehicles, we can have renewable energies, we can have hydrogen airplanes, etc. Thanks to all these technologies, we can just simply live as we did before, but without carbon emission. That sounds perfect. But the problem is that our previous way of life was causing this crisis. So we have to change the current way of life, but technology functions as a kind of ideology for not facing the reality. Technology tells us that we don't have to change the way of life because they will take care of it. But I'm basically quite skeptical about this possibility. I would rather say pandemic needs to be an opportunity to reflect up on the irrationality of the previous lifestyle and previous mode of production that aims after the endless economic growth up on this finite planet. So we rather need to envision a new fair world and more sustainable one. One of the radical reimagination of the future possibility is that, say, lockdown in Europe or lockdown in many Asian countries were actually possible. But who imagined that lockdown was possible before the pandemic? At the very beginning, China did it, and the European people laughed. Oh, it's China, that's why they can do it. But then after a couple months, they did it too. They restricted the right of the meeting, the right of moving around. That was really impressive. Something that people imagined impossible 1 year before was actually possible. So why not again for this climate crisis? Because climate crisis is much more serious challenge to humans and non-humans, of course. So why not putting emergency